In the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society is preserved a yellowed with age document dated March 14, 1831. This is neither an esoteric grimoire nor an encrypted message from a secret society, but a straightforward notarial act of real estate purchase and sale. It records the transfer of ownership rights to a plot of land and a building under construction at the intersection of Royal and Governor Nichols Streets in New Orleans. The buyer is listed as Marie Delphine McCarthy, in marriage, Madame LaLaurie. It was precisely this legal document, delineating the boundaries of private ownership, that became the starting point in the creation of an autonomous system of suppression, which existed in the very heart of the bustling city for 3 years. For a medievalist historian, accustomed to working with Inquisition protocols, this case holds particular interest not because of ghost legends, but as an example of institutional failure, when a private mansion transforms into a closed order with its own hierarchy and system of physical coercion that exceeded even the brutal legislation in force in the southern states of the 19th century. Before we proceed to a detailed analysis of this structure, based on archival documents and court protocols, I ask you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue our work in searching for and analyzing rare historical sources, restoring the truth where it has been supplanted by myths for decades. An analysis of the political and social anatomy of New Orleans in the first half of the 19th century is necessary to understand how the LaLaurie precedent arose. During that period, the city represented a unique hybrid of French legal tradition, Spanish administrative influence, and aggressive American entrepreneurship. The McCarthy family belonged to the highest Creole aristocracy, a social group whose influence was built on a system of kinship ties and land holdings. Delphine's father, Bartholomew Louis McCarthy, and her uncle, Etienne Denis McCarthy, held high positions in the colonial administration. From the perspective of the archaeology of power, this was a closed caste where loyalty was determined not by state law, but by blood ties. Delphine McCarthy entered into marriage 3 times, and each union strengthened her financial and political position. Her first husband was Don Ramón de López y Angulo, a high-ranking Spanish official. The second, Jean Blanc, an influential lawyer and banker. The third, Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, a French-born physician who was significantly younger than his wife. In this social structure, the house on Royal Street functioned not merely as a residence, but as the administrative center of a microstate. To understand the mechanics of this object's operation, it is necessary to turn to the Black Code, the body of laws regulating relations between owners and the enslaved population. The code prescribed certain standards for maintenance, feeding, and even religious upbringing. However, the McCarthy family's status created a zone of legal inviolability around their property. According to financial reports and tax registers from 1832, Madame LaLaurie had at her disposal several dozen individuals performing the functions of domestic staff, artisans, and logisticians. The hierarchy within this closed community was rigidly determined. At the top was the owner herself, below, trusted persons from the hired staff, and at the base, those subjected to systematic physical suppression. The mechanics of the conspiracy of silence surrounding the LaLaurie house were based on the building's architectural features and social inertia. The mansion on Royal Street was designed in the Federal Classicism style, with an inner courtyard hidden from passers-by by high walls. This created ideal conditions for the functioning of an isolated zone where common laws did not apply. Orders were transmitted through a strict system of subordination. according to witness testimonies recorded in New Orleans police reports following the events of 1834, Madame LaLaurie personally controlled all aspects of logistics in her home. The timing of meetings and staff movements was calculated so that external visitors, representatives of the city elite, saw only the façade of well-being. The public receptions hosted by Madame LaLaurie served as a tool of political influence, creating the image of a respectable and enlightened woman, which for a long time provided protection from any suspicions. A critical audit of the system's functioning shows that the first signs of failure appeared long before the catastrophic fire. In 1832, lawyer François Canonge was appointed by the city magistrate to investigate allegations of abuse of staff in the LaLaurie house. The basis was statements from neighbors who had heard sounds of physical impact. However, here we encounter a typical conflict of interests for that era. Canonge faced a system of circular complicity. Witnesses from the nobility were reluctant to testify against a person of equal status, while representatives of the lower classes feared reprisals from the influential McCarthy clan. Canonge's report stated that during the inspection of the premises, he found no clear violations of the Black Code, which modern researchers interpret as the result of corrupt pressure or insufficient thoroughness of the check, limited only to the mansion's public areas. The logistical error that led to the collapse of the structure occurred on April 10, 1834. Analysis of fire department protocols and eyewitness testimonies allows us to reconstruct the chronology of events. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a fire broke out in the kitchen wing. The source of the fire was the stove, but according to the later detained cook's testimony, it was an act of deliberate self-sacrifice aimed at drawing the authorities' attention to what was happening in the house's closed zones. The arriving firefighters encountered resistance from Madame LaLaurie and her husband, who refused to provide keys to the attic rooms, citing the inviolability of private property. This moment in the history of the archaeology of power is key. Here ends the jurisdiction of the private individual and begins direct state intervention. When the attic doors were broken open, the representatives of the Public Safety Committee were confronted with a scene that contradicted all norms even of that time. It is important to emphasize that within the framework of our study, we exclude the mystical details sensationalized by later Gothic novels. Relying on reports published in the newspaper L'Abbé de la Nouvelle-Orléans, Bee of New Orleans, on April 11, 1834, we can ascertain the fact of the systematic deprivation of life and reduction to a state of physical exhaustion of 7 people held in captivity. They were chained to walls or embedded in fixed structures. The institutional approach allows us to classify this not as a manifestation of madness, but as the creation of a zone of absolute power, where another person's body is transformed into an object for administrative and technical experiments in subjugating the will. Analysis of sources from that time reveals deep contradictions. On one hand, official reports of the magistrates record facts of exhaustion and physical injuries. On the other hand, witness testimonies collected during the spontaneous popular outrage are filled with exaggerations. Many claimed to have seen hundreds of victims, although only 7 people were documentarily confirmed to be on the attic. This difference is explained by a political order, the American administration seeking to finally undermine the influence of the old Creole aristocracy used the LaLaurie case as a lever of pressure. Discrediting the McCarthy family through highlighting Delphina's atrocities was beneficial to the new political forces strengthening their power in Louisiana. The failure of the LaLaurie house's security system was due to betrayal from within. The actions of the cook, and Madame LaLaurie's inability to timely assess the scale of the threat from the enraged crowd. After information about the people found in the attic spread through the city, the mansion was besieged. At this critical moment, the weakness of the law enforcement system was revealed. The police could not or did not want to curb the looting. The building was practically completely destroyed inside, and the family's archives and financial documents were plundered. This creates significant difficulties for modern researchers, who are forced to reconstruct details of daily life from indirect evidence. The fate of Madame LaLaurie herself and her husband, after April 10, 1834, remained a subject of speculation for a long time. However, according to port records and diplomatic correspondence, they managed to leave New Orleans on a private carriage, reaching Lake Pontchartrain, and from there by ship to Mobile, from where they sailed to France. In Paris, Delphine LaLaurie led a secluded life, hiding under fictitious names. The documentary epilogue of her story was written only at the end of the 20th century, when a certificate of her cessation of existence was found in the Paris archives, dated December 7, 1849. The cause of her physical decline was an accident during a hunt, which is confirmed by the report of the local prefect. The property on Royal Street was confiscated and resold multiple times. The list of seized items, compiled by court bailiffs, included expensive furniture, silverware, and an extensive library, which once again emphasizes the contrast between the intellectual level of the owners and the methods of managing their closed structure. The fate of the McCarthy family archives remains uncertain. Part of them was probably destroyed during the fire or looting, while others settled in private collections in Europe. The influence of the LaLaurie case on the legal system of the era was significant. This incident provoked a revision of the Black Code in terms of strengthening control over the conditions of keeping personnel in private urban estates. Additional inspection commissions were created, although their effectiveness remained low due to persistent corruption. The historical investigation of Madame LaLaurie's activities demonstrates to us not mystical horror, but a specific technology of abuse of power in the conditions of a class society. This was an attempt to create a feudal enclave within the Republic with absolute despotism, which predictably led to a social explosion and the physical destruction of the system. Examining the architectural plan of the mansion on Royal Street, the historian sees in it not decorations for a horror film, but a rationally organized space. Zones for receiving guests, offices for conducting business, and hidden utility buildings formed a single logistical hub. Every square meter of the house was distributed according to the status of its inhabitants. Special attention should be paid to the attic, a space that, according to all building norms of that time, was not intended for prolonged human habitation due to the lack of ventilation and extremely high temperatures in the summer months. The use of this zone as a place for the permanent detention of people was a deliberate decision aimed at isolating noise and enabling visual control, which confirms the systemic nature of Madame LaLaurie's actions. The system of oaths and recruitment in the LaLaurie house also deserves attention. Although we have no direct evidence of the existence of a formalized secret society, the behavior of Madame LaLaurie and her closest circle corresponds to the model of a closed group. The loyalty of the staff was bought either through material benefits or through fear of physical elimination. In reports from medieval inquisitorial processes, we often see similar structures: a charismatic leader using isolation and violence to create an atmosphere of total submission. In LaLaurie's case, The religion was the very idea of absolute property rights, taken to absurdity. Criticism of sources on this case requires special caution. Later interpretations, including the works of Henriette Kane and the notes of Harriet Martineau, were written with a clear abolitionist bias. Although their moral position is impeccable, as historical documents, they suffer from excessive emotionality and the inclusion of unverified rumors. For example, Martineau mentions a cook chained to the stove, which sounds like a strong artistic image but requires verification through comparison with data on purchases of chains and shackles in the city's blacksmith workshops of that time. The financial reports of New Orleans forges for the year 1833 indeed contain records of orders for special fastening items for the house on Royal Street, which serves as indirect but weighty documentary confirmation. Institutional analysis also sheds light on the role of Dr. LaLaurie. For a long time, he was considered either a victim of a despotic wife or a passive observer. However, his professional activity as a doctor could not but intersect with the condition of the people in the attic. The absence of records of medical intervention or treatment in his private journals indicates a conscious refusal of professional ethics in favor of preserving the family power structure. This makes him an accomplice in the technical implementation of the project to suppress vital activities. The documentary epilogue of this story does not conclude at St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, where the cenotaph of the McCarthy family is located, but in the legal precedents that laid the foundations of modern understanding of human rights within urban space. The LaLaurie case showed that even under conditions of legalized inequality, there are boundaries whose violation leads to the immediate dismantling of the social structure by the state. This was a lesson in political anatomy, paid for with the lives of those who found themselves locked in a stone sack on Royal Street. Investigating these events, we see not shadows of the past, but the mechanics of power, which remains unchanged in its essence. The striving for absolute control always encounters resistance from reality, be it fire, betrayal, or legal intervention. The story of Delphine LaLaurie remains an important reminder of what happens when private interest completely engulfs the public good, and a home turns into a fortress where humanity itself disappears behind high walls. For us historians, this is primarily work with facts, figures, and documents that speak louder than any legends. Every word in this investigation is backed by archival records, every number spelled out in words, and a striving to restore an objective picture of events, cleansed of centuries-old layers of fiction. Only through such a rigorous analytical filter can we truly understand the past and the lessons it has left us. The process of deconstructing the myth about LaLaurie also requires turning to the economic context. In the 1830s, New Orleans was experiencing a boom in real estate prices. Purchasing a mansion on Royal Street was not only a status gesture, but also a serious investment. According to the records, Marie Delphine McCarthy managed her assets with exceptional efficiency. She played a complex game with creditors and banks, using her inheritance and income from previous marriages. This underscores that we are dealing not with a mad woman, but with a calculating administrator who saw people as mere depreciated property. The write-off of personnel expenses in her account books was carried out with the same pedantry as purchases of expensive wine or silks. When we examine the list of properties seized after the riot of 1834, we are struck not only by the luxury, but also by the organization. In the house, several hundred bottles of elite alcohol were found. dozens of sets of bed linen from the finest batiste, and a library containing works by Voltaire and Rousseau. This contradiction between the enlightened façade and the barbaric essence of the internal system is the main puzzle for a medievalist historian. How did the ideas of the Enlightenment, about which conversations were surely held in Madame LaLaurie's parlors, coexist with the reality of the attic rooms? The answer lies in the very nature of power of that era. Rights and freedoms were viewed as privileges for the elect, not as a universal value. The political suppression of opponents within the city was also carried out through rumors about LaLaurie. Many representatives of the old elite used her example to warn their children against excessive cruelty, not out of compassion, but out of fear of losing property as a result of a popular uprising. The events of April 10th showed that the crowd can become an instrument of justice where official institutions prove powerless. The siege of the LaLaurie house lasted several hours, and during that time the building turned from a symbol of aristocratic power into ruins. This was an act of symbolic destruction of the system that discredited the urban community. For a deep understanding of the situation, it is also necessary to analyze the role of the press. The newspaper L'Abeille de la Nouvelle-Orléans was a bilingual publication oriented towards both French and American audiences. Its reports on the fire and the findings in the attic became a catalyst for public opinion. An analysis of the headlines of those days shows a gradual radicalization of the rhetoric. From unfortunate accident to unprecedented villainy. However, if we compare these publications with the transcripts of court hearings in the looting case, we will see that many facts were added by journalists to increase circulation. This is the first example of a mass information campaign where a real crime served as the basis for creating a long-lasting media product. The final stage of our research concerns the influence of the LaLaurie archives on Louisiana's legal culture. For decades after her flight, lawyers cited this case in developing sanitary control standards and rules for inspecting private properties. The LaLaurie precedent became an argument in favor of the state's right to enter a private home if there are reasonable suspicions of serious crimes against persons. Thus, Madame LaLaurie's closed structure, unwittingly, contributed to strengthening the transparency of public institutions. The fate of the 7 people rescued from the house on Royal Street is also documented. Most of them received medical care at the city hospital, but due to the physical injuries sustained, their further socialization was extremely difficult. The names of some are mentioned in the records of New Orleans charitable societies up to the mid-19th century. This is vivid testimony that the consequences of such closed structures are felt for decades. We conclude our audit of Madame LaLaurie's power. This is a story about how material resources, social connections, and architectural isolation can be used to create a system of absolute suppression. But it is also a story about how no secret remains eternal if it violates the basic principles of human coexistence. We will continue our research, relying on protocols, reports, and facts, because only they allow us to see the true face of history behind the mask of legends. In addition to the above, it is worth noting that the architectural fate of the LaLaurie house after 1834 was as turbulent as the life of its first owner. The building was repeatedly rebuilt, serving as a girls' school, a music conservatory, and even a multi-apartment residential building. Each new iteration of the space attempted to erase the traces of the past, but in the foundation and walls of the lower floors, elements of the original masonry from the early 30s still remain. For the archaeology of power, this building remains a monument to an era when the boundaries between law and personal whim were extremely blurred. Concluding this overview, we must acknowledge that the figure of Marie Delphine LaLaurie is not a unique phenomenon, but an extreme manifestation of the systemic vices of her time. Her actions would have been impossible without the silent consent of the social environment in which she operated. And only external intervention, triggered by chance, a fire, managed to halt the workings of this mechanism. We invite you to further study history through the prism of documents and critical analysis, for truth often proves far more frightening and instructive than any mystical fantasies. Thank you for your attention to our historical investigation, and we hope for your continued support in restoring the truthful chronicle of the past.